The shuttle banked through clouds the color of crushed amethyst, and Ethan Varrick pressed his forehead against the viewport, watching the palace below grow from a distant shimmer into something that defied reasonable architecture. Spires twisted upward like frozen lightning, connected by bridges that seemed to float on nothing but optimism, and perhaps some physics he'd slept through in academy. He'd been to 17 worlds in his 3 years as a liaison, and Kaelith Prime still made him feel like a child seeing his first hologram. Approaching landing vector 77 Alpha, the shuttle's AI announced in that aggressively cheerful tone that all AI seemed contractually obligated to use. Please ensure all appendages are secured inside the vehicle. Ethan glanced at the Zelthian diplomat across from him, a being that was mostly tentacles and philosophical observations. Does that warning ever apply to you, or is it just for us boring bipeds? The Zelthian's translator chip rendered what might have been laughter as a sound like wind chimes falling downstairs. I find your species' obsession with limb counting endlessly amusing. The shuttle settled onto a landing platform that gleamed like polished obsidian. Beyond the transparent dome overhead, 3 moons hung in a sky that couldn't decide between green and gold. Ethan gathered his data tablet, thoroughly outdated by the standards of every species here except humanity, and followed the other passengers down the ramp. The air tasted electric, processed through atmospheric regulators that probably cost more than his childhood home. A functionary met them at the entrance, a species Ethan didn't recognize. Tall, angular, with skin that shifted through shades of copper. Representatives will proceed to the Celestial Assembly. Seating is determined by treaty weight and economic contribution. The functionary's eyes barely grazed Ethan. Peripheral seating is along the western colonnade. Peripheral. The word humanity had worn like an old coat for 2 centuries. Not quite ignored, not quite included. Ethan nodded and let himself be swept along by the crowd of dignitaries, each more elaborately decorated than the last. A Korthan general wore armor that hummed with defensive fields. A Theshan merchant had bioluminescent patterns crawling across her scales in what was probably advertising. And then there was Ethan in his nicest jacket, the one without coffee stains, representing a species that had barely figured out faster-than-light travel before stumbling into a galaxy already organized, cataloged, and thoroughly unimpressed. The corridor stretched for what felt like kilometers, walls lined with something between crystal and liquid that showed ghostly images of past assemblies. He caught glimpses of species long extinct, treaties signed and broken, the endless bureaucracy of keeping thousands of civilizations from mutual annihilation. It was either inspiring or depressing, and Ethan hadn't decided which. First time, someone asked. Ethan turned to find a delegate from Myra's Reach, a species that resembled humans if humans were made of smoke and good intentions. That obvious. You're looking at everything. Most of us stopped seeing it centuries ago. Ethan smiled. I'm still at the tourist stage. Give me a few thousand years. Your species has time. We've been watching. You're stubborn. We prefer persistently optimistic. The corridor opened into the assembly hall, and Ethan's breath caught despite himself. The chamber was a cathedral to power, vaulted ceilings that disappeared into darkness punctuated by floating lights, tier upon tier of seating arranged in concentric circles around a central dais where the throne sat. Not a throne, really. More like the idea of a throne rendered in matter that seemed uncertain about remaining solid. Thousands of beings filled the space, their conversations creating a sound like a distant ocean. Ethan spotted the human section immediately, a small cluster of seats far to the left, half hidden behind a structural column. Of course. He began making his way along the perimeter, nodding politely to delegates who didn't notice him, stepping carefully around species whose personal space requirements he could only guess at. He was almost to his destination when the hall fell silent, not gradually, instantly, as if someone had cut the universe's audio feed. Ethan froze mid-step, one foot hovering awkwardly above the floor. Every head, tentacle, and sensory organ turned toward the dais. She had arrived. Empress Kaerith had learned to wear silence like others wore crowns. She moved through the private antechamber behind the assembly hall, her attendants trailing at the prescribed distance of 7 paces, a number chosen by some long-dead protocol minister who'd apparently had strong feelings about personal space. Her reflection caught in the polished walls, pale blue skin gleaming under lights calibrated to make her appear eternal, untouchable, vaguely divine. Some days she wondered if she'd become more symbol than person, a hologram of authority projected across 1,000 worlds. "The assembly is ready, luminous one," her chief attendant murmured, using the formal address that always made Kaerith feel like she should be glowing or perhaps exploding gently into stardust. "Remind me what today's agenda includes, Sarix." The attendant consulted a data stream visible only through her neural implant. Trade disputes between the Kellian Confederacy and the Outer Rim Collective. A petition from the crystalline enclaves regarding mining rights on dead stars. And Ambassador Threndix will present his 15-year report on atmospheric taxation. 15 years. Kaerith adjusted one of the silver rings on her left ear, feeling its familiar weight. Has he been talking that entire time, or does he pause occasionally? Sarix's expression didn't change. Attendants were trained to ignore imperial humor, but Kaerith caught the slightest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Small victories. She'd been Empress for 43 years, which was either a long time or an eye blink depending on which species you asked. The Vaelorn themselves lived for centuries, which meant Kaerith was still considered young by her people's standards, though she felt ancient in her bones. The weight of empire did that compressed time, turned years into a single endless moment of decisions and consequences. "Shall I signal your entrance, luminous one?" Kaerith nodded, and somewhere beyond the chamber doors, harmonic tones announced her approach. She'd always hated that sound, like someone strangling a choir of bells, but tradition demanded it. The doors dissolved into light, a particle trick that cost more energy than most planets generated in a day, and she stepped into the assembly hall. The silence was immediate and absolute. Thousands of beings ceased breathing, speaking, existing in any way that might draw attention from the Empress. She hated this part too, the theater of dominance, but it was necessary. An empire this vast ran on perception as much as power. She ascended the dais, her robes trailing behind her with programmed precision, each fold calculated by fashion algorithms to suggest both strength and grace. The throne recognized her biosignature and adjusted its quantum state, becoming simultaneously solid and ethereal beneath her. She sat, arranged her hands in the approved manner, and allowed herself a single moment to scan the assembly before the tedium began. Tier upon tier of delegates, each representing worlds she'd never visit, problems she'd never fully understand. The front rows held the powerful, species with fleets, resources, votes that mattered. Further back sat the peripheral members, those admitted to the empire more out of geographic necessity than any real belief in their importance. Her gaze drifted past generals in their ceremonial armor, merchants calculating profit margins behind polite smiles, priests from a dozen faiths all equally certain their gods were real and everyone else's were metaphors. Then something caught her attention. A human, weaving through the crowd with the careful uncertainty of someone trying very hard not to accidentally offend an alien custom. Humans were still rare in these assemblies, their civilization too young, too unproven. This one wore clothing that was clean but unremarkable, carried himself with neither arrogance nor submission, just a kind of quiet competence that reminded her of. Her mind stopped. She knew that walk, the way he moved through space as if apologizing for taking up room in it. 2 years ago, on Hellion 9, during the refugee crisis when 17 species had nearly torn each other apart over resource allocation. She'd watched surveillance feeds while her advisors debated military intervention, and she'd seen him, This human, sitting with a dying Korthan soldier, holding the being's hand even though Korthans found touch deeply uncomfortable, because dying alone was worse. Ambassador Threndix began his presentation, his voice a droning hum about atmospheric particulate revenues, and Kaerith realized she hadn't heard a word. Her focus remained locked on the human as he found a seat in the shadows, clearly hoping to disappear. She watched him glance around, noticed the small smile when a Zelthian delegate's translator malfunctioned and announced glorious taxation instead of glorious nation. A decision crystallized in her mind, sharp and sudden and completely unprecedented. Her attendants would be horrified. The court would spend months analyzing it. But Kaerith had spent 43 years being predictable, and she discovered she was very tired of being a symbol. She stood, and the assembly forgot how to breathe. Ethan's first thought was that he'd somehow broken something. The Empress had risen from her throne, and in his limited experience with imperial protocol, unscheduled standing usually preceded executions or at least strongly worded deportations. He ran through a mental checklist of possible offenses: wrong seat, wrong posture, wrong species, wrong existence in general. The silence in the hall had weight now, physical pressure against his eardrums. Ambassador Threndix had stopped mid-word, his mouth hanging open in a way that would have been funny if Ethan weren't fairly certain he was about to become a galactic incident. She descended the dais steps, each movement precise, and Ethan's brain helpfully supplied the thought that her robe seemed to be made of captured starlight, which was poetic but profoundly unhelpful in understanding why an empress was walking away from her throne during an active assembly. Her guards shifted, hands moving toward weapons they probably didn't need because what threat could possibly emerge in a room full of witnesses and enough firepower to vaporize a small moon? The crowd parted like water, delegates pressing themselves backward into their seats. Ethan spotted a Thessian merchant actually climbing over the row behind him to create more distance. He would have done the same, except his legs had apparently decided that moving was no longer part of their job description. She was walking toward his section. Definitely his section. The human section, where 5 representatives sat frozen in various states of panic. Ethan's colleague Miriam had gone pale, which was impressive given her naturally dark complexion. Chen was mouthing something that might have been a prayer or possibly just random syllables strung together by a mind in freefall. Then the Empress stopped, directly in front of Ethan, close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her pale blue skin, like frost on glass, and the way her amber eyes held something that might have been amusement or might have been the expression one makes before announcing a public execution. I should probably bow, Ethan thought, then realized he was already sitting, and bowing from a seated position would just look like he was checking his shoes for something. He started to stand, a jerky half motion that nearly knocked over the delegate beside him, a floating Aerith who wobbled in their containment field. She extended her hand. It hovered in the space between them, pale fingers steady, while Ethan's entire understanding of politics and appropriate behavior collapsed into confused rubble. Behind her, an attendant had gone so rigid she might have been a statue. One of the guards had his hand on his weapon, though Ethan suspected that was more from sheer bewilderment than actual threat assessment. "Is this?" Ethan whispered, not sure if he was asking the universe or his own malfunctioning sense of reality. "Is this happening?" Her lips curved slightly. "Your hand, Representative Varrick." She knew his name. The Empress of an empire spanning 40,000 worlds knew his name, and Ethan's brain filed that information under problems to panic about later, because his hand was apparently moving of its own accord, reaching up to meet hers. Her fingers closed around his, warm, surprisingly solid, as if he'd half expected her to be a hologram, and the contact sent a jolt through the room like someone had plugged the assembly into a power core. "You sit with me," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet. Ethan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He was vaguely aware that he resembled a fish attempting philosophy, but coherent speech had gone on vacation and left no forwarding address. Around them, the whispers started, 1,000 conversations erupting simultaneously in languages Ethan couldn't speak, though he understood the universal undertone of what in all the burning stars is happening. She didn't release his hand, just turned and began walking back toward the dais, and Ethan's options were follow or become the human who rejected an imperial summons in front of the entire known galaxy. He stumbled after her, his free hand reaching out to steady himself on nothing because the floor suddenly seemed like more of a suggestion than a solid surface. "This is fine," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. "This is a totally normal thing that happens. Empresses hold hands with random humans all the time. It's probably in a handbook somewhere." They reached the stairs, and Ethan glanced back to see the entire assembly staring with expressions ranging from shock to horror, to what might have been vindication on the face of a Myron delegate, who'd probably had money on most unprecedented event of the century. Miriam had her face in her hands. Chen appeared to be having a quiet existential crisis. The Empress ascended the steps, and Ethan followed, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat announcing either his elevation or his doom. When they reached the top, the throne somehow produced a second seat, matter reorganizing itself with a soft shimmer, and she gestured to it with her free hand. "I really hope," Ethan said quietly, finally finding his voice, "that I didn't accidentally agree to something binding by touching your hand. Because my legal team is just me with a dictionary and good intentions." Her laugh was soft, unexpected, and somewhere in the audience, he heard something that might have been a collective gasp or possibly the sound of several species' worldviews shattering simultaneously. The seat materialized beneath Ethan with the unsettling sensation of sitting on something that was still deciding whether to be furniture or abstract concept. He settled into it cautiously, half expecting it to vanish and send him tumbling down the dais in what would definitely become the most-watched holovid in galactic history. The Empress sat beside him, composed as if she routinely collected stray humans during state functions, and the assembly remained frozen in what Ethan was starting to think of as catastrophic confusion mode. Ambassador Threndick stood at the speaking platform, his prepared remarks on atmospheric taxation apparently no longer relevant to anyone's interests. He cleared his throat, a sound like grinding machinery, and attempted to resume, but his words came out in a jumbled mess about revenue streams and unprecedented protocols before he simply stopped and sat down. "I've broken galactic politics," Ethan whispered, staring straight ahead. "That's got to be some kind of record for humanity." "You've done nothing," the Empress replied, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I have made a choice, and they are adapting. Adapting looks a lot like collective panic from where I'm sitting. Give them a moment. Bureaucracies move slowly, even when their foundations shift." Ethan risked a glance at her. Up close, he could see the fine silver threading in her robes, patterns that moved with light that wasn't quite there. Her ears rose to elegant points, each adorned with rings that hummed with what he suspected was either decoration or extremely expensive surveillance technology. She met his eyes, and he saw something there that surprised him, weariness, maybe, or a kind of careful hope. "Can I ask," he said, "why you just destroyed every piece of protocol ever written to sit me next to you? Because I'm fairly certain this isn't standard procedure for species ranked somewhere between tolerated, and we'll get back to you in a few centuries." She was quiet for a moment, watching the assembly slowly remember how to function. A new speaker approached the platform, a Kaelian diplomat who kept glancing at the dais as if checking whether reality had stabilized. "2 years ago," the Empress said, "on Hellion 9 there was a crisis." Ethan's stomach dropped. "You know about that. 17 species, fighting over resources while refugees died in camps. My advisors wanted military intervention. I watched the feeds instead, looking for a reason not to send fleets." She turned to him fully now, and he saw that her eyes held something fierce beneath the imperial calm. "I saw you, Representative Varrick. I saw you organizing supply lines while others argued about jurisdiction. I saw you mediating between species who hated each other. I saw you sit with a dying Korthan soldier and hold his hand, even though you knew touch was painful for his kind, because you couldn't let him die alone." "I didn't think anyone was watching," Ethan said quietly. "Everyone was watching the politicians and generals. I was watching the spaces between." She gestured to the assembly below, thousands of beings now conducting business in hushed tones, still stealing glances at the throne. "This empire runs on power, on hierarchy, on the belief that worth is measured in fleet sizes and economic output. Your species has neither, so you are dismissed, overlooked, seated in shadows. But I have spent 43 years maintaining an empire, and I have learned that the truest measure of a civilization is not what it projects, but what it does when no one is counting the cost." A Thessian speaker was addressing trade concerns now, her voice steadier though she kept losing her place in her notes. The assembly was finding its rhythm again, adapting as the Empress had predicted, though Ethan suspected the subtext of every conversation had shifted to, "What does this mean for us?" "So this is," Ethan gestured vaguely at the throne, the seat, the impossible situation. "What exactly?" "A statement. A reminder that an empire's strength lies not in its ability to enforce hierarchy, but in its willingness to recognize worth wherever it appears." She smiled, and it transformed her face from imperial authority to something almost mischievous. "Also, it seemed appropriate to prove that humans are not as peripheral as my court believes. You could have sent a memo. Where's the impact in that?" Ethan laughed, a sound that felt dangerous and liberating in equal measure. Below, he saw Miriam had recovered enough to sit upright, though Chen still looked like he was contemplating a career change to something less stressful, like diffusing antimatter bombs. The other delegates were watching with expressions that ranged from calculation to respect, and Ethan realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just for him, but for every human trying to find their place in a galaxy that had been organized long before they arrived. "I should probably warn you," he said, "that I have no idea what I'm doing up here. My diplomatic training consisted of a weekend seminar and a pamphlet titled 'Try Not to Offend Anyone,' but if you do, apologize quickly. Then you're precisely as qualified as most of my advisors, with the advantage of being honest about it." She stood, and Ethan scrambled to follow, nearly tripping over his own feet. The assembly rose as one, a wave of motion that rippled through the tiers. "This session is adjourned," the Empress announced, her voice carrying through the hall without apparent effort. "We reconvene tomorrow, when I expect everyone will have adjusted to new seating arrangements." As they descended the dais together, slowly, because Ethan's legs still weren't entirely convinced they worked, he leaned slightly toward her. "Does this mean I need to learn all 17 verses of the Imperial Anthem?" "Only the first 12. The last 5 are optional." "That's a relief. I can't carry a tune in a cargo container." They reached the floor and the crowd parted again, but this time Ethan noticed something different in how the delegates moved. Not just fear or confusion, but a kind of recalibration, as if they were seeing him, and by extension, humanity through a different lens. An empire had just bent its protocols, and the ripples would spread far beyond this hall. The Empress released his hand at the chamber's entrance, where her attendants waited with expressions suggesting they'd need years of therapy to process the last hour. "I trust you can find your way back to your quarters, Representative Varrick." "I managed to find my way here from Earth. I think I can handle a palace." He paused, then added, "Thank you for seeing us for this." "Thank you," she replied, "for reminding me why I built an empire in the first place. Not to enforce hierarchy, but to make space for those worth knowing." She turned and swept away in a rustle of light-catching robes, her attendants trailing behind in their prescribed formation. Ethan stood alone in the corridor, watching her go, and felt the weight of change settling over him like a coat he hadn't known he needed. When he finally made his way back to the human quarters, he found Miriam and Chen waiting with expressions that promised a very long conversation about what had just happened and what it meant for humanity's place in the Empire. But for now, Ethan allowed himself a moment to simply exist in the aftermath of the impossible, a human who'd been seen, chosen, elevated not through military might or economic power, but through the simple act of being decent when no one was watching. It wasn't the story he'd expected to live, but then again, the best stories never were. Never were. Outside the palace windows, Kaelith Prime's 3 moons hung in their eternal dance, and somewhere in the vast machinery of empire, protocols were being rewritten to accommodate the truth that worth couldn't be measured in fleet sizes alone. It was a small shift, perhaps, but Ethan had learned that empires, like people, changed not through grand gestures but through moments of recognition. When someone powerful enough to ignore you chose instead to take your hand and say, simply, unmistakably, "You sit with me."